QSO Today, episode 367, Augie Gus Hansen, KB0YH. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur radio call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is still in on-demand mode until September 13th. This means that you can still go to the VFairs platform, explore the exhibit hall for downloadable content, and the auditorium for all the presentations. Many of them now have the Q&A. Please go to our Expo website for more information. Augie Gus Hansen, KB0YH, always had an interest in radio but did not get his first ticket until he was in his mid-30s. Gus enjoys operating the 80-meter nets and building antennas, now especially STL or small transmitting loops, or also known as magnetic loop antennas. And as this is the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, Gus has his own story to tell in this QSO Today. KB0YH, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Gus?
I am, Eric. You're loud and clear in Mile High, Denver.
And you're loud and clear in Efrat, Israel. Gus, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
And actually, I got into ham radio late compared to a lot of the people you've interviewed who started in their teens or in some cases even earlier, I suspect. I didn't start until 1978 at the age of 34. The reason for that was my radio experience early in life was broadcasting. I got started at the age of 14, and I can explain how that happened, but ham radio came along much later after I moved out here to Denver and worked in an office for several years and then shut it down because we were in the oil shale industry doing surveys and environmental impact statements and that sort of thing. When oil shale went dead, I had some time off. I studied Morse code, or practiced Morse code, I should say, and studied the guides, listened to a number of hams on a radio. I had a shortwave receiver. And so 1978 was when I got going. And I came into the hobby as an advanced class operator because I took all the tests and had to wait about 3 months before I got my license in the mail. The folks at Gettysburg, I guess is where they were doing the processing, were running about 3 months behind time. So early in January of 1978 is when I got my call sign, which was WD0 Golf Alpha Fox. And I used that for about 3 years. And then when they allowed us to change our call signs, extra class was given the opportunity to get a 2x2 call. That's when I got KB0YH.
As a teenager, you got interested in broadcast radio. How did that play out for you? Did you get a broadcast license, first class radio, telephone, things like that?
Yes, I did. The thing that kicked it off for me was winning a contest. I was 14 years old at the time, and there was a station, WRIB, which stood for Rhode Island Broadcasting, of all things. It was a little 1 kilowatt daytime, 250 watt nighttime station, but they were playing rock and roll and a little bit of a rhythm and blues style of music, which I really enjoyed. I was learning to play guitar at the time and had a lot of fun listening to the radio, and they had a contest. So You Want to Be a DJ was the name of it, and I submitted an application or a little story. They wanted to know why you wanted to be a disc jockey, and I won. In fact, I was the first one that they put on the air, and to their chagrin, I was not very good at it. At 14 years old, I didn't know anything about radio other than what I heard on the air. And when I was there, I had 1 hour on the air, and I used it as my own personal jukebox and played the songs I wanted to play. But they were looking for the down low on who's dating who and what's going on at school and all that other good stuff. And I didn't do any of that. And so they were kind of miffed, I think, about that. But they gave me the radio and a few other things that were prizes for my being there and the 1 hour on the air. And that just sort of lit the fuse for me. And from then on, I was involved in broadcasting in one way or another for almost 20 years.
And what was the radio they gave you?
Oh, it was just a little AM radio. They didn't even have AM, FM radios at the time. It was just a little AM radio, one of those. It wasn't even a tube radio. It was a beginning of a solid state distribution of radios. This was probably what would it have been, 1958, something like that. So it was an early transistorized AM broadcast receiver. That's all.
Did you have to get a third-class radio telephone to be able to spin discs there?
No, I did not. I was just a guest in the studio, but later on, when I graduated high school and started at University of Rhode Island in 1962, that's where I went to school, I ended up having to get a second class, rather. I had to get second class because I was involved with the school radio station, WRIU. It was an AM carrier current. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in the early days of radio on campus, oftentimes the signals were distributed by AM carrier current, where the signals would be sent over wires that were strung around the campus, telephone lines or just lines that we put in ourselves. And in the dormitories and in some of the frat houses and sorority houses, there would be little transmitters that would put the signal onto the AC wiring. And people could plug in their radios and pick up the signal right through the distribution of AC in the building.
Why do you think that they didn't just give the campus a regular broadcast license? I think carrier current was popular in universities in California, as I recall, as well.
Yeah, pretty much nationwide. I don't know how it is in other countries, but it was a way of being able to put a signal on the air, or make a signal available to the students, but not put anything on the air. The problem there, if you're getting an AM license or an FM license, you have to have somebody who's in charge with the appropriate licensing. And that takes a lot of work, and it costs money usually. And the schools didn't want to spend that money. So the AM carrier current was a cheap way to get the signal out to the students.
And did you have a large listener base of students that would listen to the school radio station?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, at the time, it was about 15,000 students on campus, I think. It's grown quite a bit since then. But we had a listenership on the order of a couple of thousand pretty much all the time. We had the station on from about 10 o'clock in the morning until almost midnight. Well, after midnight, we shut down right at midnight, actually. And we had really good listenership. We got a lot of feedback. We had telephone call-ins on some of the shows. And it was a good station. We had a lot of fun there and played all different kinds of music, did some talk shows, and got a very strong audience.
Now, you were pursuing a BSCE at the University of Rhode Island?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, it's my understanding from some research that I've done is that you actually probably did work study at General Dynamics Electric Boat during those years. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for me, I had no support from family. My mom and dad didn't really have the money to put anybody in college. A few years later, they did help my sister get her degree. She was a science teacher when she finished her education at Rhode Island College, but that came 3 years after me. But it took me 8 years to get through because I was literally doing work study almost the whole time and supporting a family as well as paying for the college education. But I ended up at about 19, I guess it was late 60s. I ended up working for General Dynamics, 66 actually, sort of the middle of the 60s. And I'd work during the day, go to school at night. They had school classes either on the URI campus in Kingston or in Providence. And I'd go take 2 or 3 night courses. And then later on in my school time, probably about my 3rd and 4th and 5th years, I was working at night at Electric Boat and doing school during the day. So I got a lot of freedom from the companies that I worked for. I was involved in a radio station, a couple of them actually, during that time as well. But I was able to work it out so that I could take school and do work and support the family all at once.
One of the things that caught my attention with General Dynamics Electric Boat, when we refer to electric boats, I think we're talking about submarines, aren't we?
We are indeed. Yeah, it was an interesting job because I was working on what are called research submersibles. They're submarines. And the research submersibles are little small things they would call Star 2 and Star 3. You may have heard of Alvin. That was one that came earlier. That was not General Dynamics, but I worked on Star 2 and Star 3, and these were used for doing underwater research, checking on the health of underwater cabling, doing various studies, and there were also other attributes. But I also got to work on the nuclear subs on occasion. They were down in along the river, and further up the river was the New London sub base. And I spent a lot of my time at the New London sub base working on steering and diving control system, simulators, the fleet ballistic missile controls that we used to open the hatches and fire the missiles on these big fleet ballistic missile submarines, they were called. And my job was to install, maintain all the training systems that we used to train the sub drivers who were going to be going out in the ocean later on.
Did they actually have simulators so that you could have the sense that you were actually piloting a submarine?
Yes, when you went into the room where the controls were, you were literally sitting in the CIC of a submarine, in effect, although it was on dry land. And we used operational amplifiers at the time. This was before a lot of the digital electronic stuff came in. This was early in the 60s and into the mid-60s. I worked at Electric Boat from probably 63, I think it was, through quite a bit later, almost up until 68, I think. But that was when I ended up, let's see, I started at 66 is when I started at General Dynamics. Before that, I had been working in radio. So anyway, it was the mid-60s through almost 1970 when I was working at General Dynamics. And the submarines, the people who were going to be running the submarines had to be trained on these simulators. And it really, it made the environment just like what they were going to experience when they were out on missions. And so we had to make sure that all of the operating systems worked properly. All of the operational amplifiers were used to simulate the meter circuits and show depth and all of the other things that they would experience.
Well, it sounds absolutely fascinating because it's one of those things that not everybody sees. I mean, I guess we see in some of the ports in America, like the World War II or Korean War submarines, but we don't see anything, big and brilliant.
Yeah, the fleet ballistic missile submarines were quite breathtaking in size and scope. I did get a chance to go on them on a number of occasions, the real subs, not the simulators, and work on certain pieces of it. And a lot of times I'd get called in. I was a troubleshooter. I'd get called in to work on equipment that had failed. And we worked in what was called a research lab. And they'd send the equipment there, and we'd diagnose the problem and fix it and get it back so that they could put that sub back in service. We were part of the overall routine maintenance and repair of some of these nuclear subs.
Once you've finished your degree and you left General Dynamics, did you stay in the electronics business?
I did. I went to Raytheon Company. They actually hired me about 6 months before I graduated. They were looking for someone with my skill set, and they initially had us at the what was called the Underwater Sound Lab in New London, Connecticut. And I worked there for about 6 months before I transferred up to Portsmouth area. Lived in Newport, Rhode Island, but worked at the Sub-SIG division, submarine signal division, that is. They did sonar and various other things related to submarines also. And I worked in what was called the environmental division. They were starting up a new business venture, if you will. And we worked alongside the people who were doing the sonar stuff in the same buildings, but we were doing something entirely different, building equipment to measure air quality, water quality, wind speed and direction, meteorology type things. And it was an interesting job. I did design engineering during that phase of my life.
Okay, so then we're getting close to where you're tipping into amateur radio, and you've moved to Denver, Colorado. Did you have any mentors that helped you get that first license?
Early on, I did not. It was all on my own. I had a good background in the technology. I just had to learn some of the laws, the rules and regulations of ham radio, and study the Morse code or practice the Morse code. And I passed the 5-word-a-minute test. This would be in September of 77, I believe it was. And I passed that test, and I passed whatever was necessary. All I wanted to do was get the first license that I could get. Technician was what I was going for. And I passed that. And the guy that was running the test said, well, you did really well on that. You didn't miss anything. So would you like to try the general test? And I took that and I passed that too. I think I missed one question there. And he said, well, look, you're on a roll. Why don't you do the advanced test? So I said, I haven't studied any of that stuff. He said, that's okay. Just take the test. And I did, and I passed it. I missed about 3 or 4 questions, I think. And so I ended up qualifying for advanced in the testing part, but not in the code part. So I had to go back about a week about 2 weeks later, I guess. I went back and I passed the 13 words a minute. So I was qualified for an advanced class license in September of 77. But as I said, I didn't receive the actual license until January 6th of 1978.
And how did you bring your code speed up in 2 weeks?
2 things. 73 magazine, thanks Wayne Green, had some tapes. And I got to meet him later in life, by the way. We'll talk about that later maybe. But I listened to those, and I also listened to the ARRL broadcasts of Morse code, and I worked my way up from there.
So you really buckled down for that 2 weeks to get that code speed up, yeah?
It was a forced march. I don't do anything well unless I force myself into it by setting a goal of some kind. And I just said, okay, I'm not going to do anything else except eat and sleep, perhaps, and just do Morse code until I'm up to the 13 words a minute. And as soon as I felt comfortable there, I went down and took the test.
And now this message from ICOM America. Contest remotely or from the comfort of your own home. You heard that right. The 3 ICOM rigs that I'll discuss in this message can be remotely controlled using the optional RSBA1 software. And these days, given the high electronic noise and HOA restrictions, you might want to remotely operate your ICOM rig in a mountain cabin or a rural parcel from anywhere in the world over the Internet. Now you can. ICOM has the perfect base station ready for remote control action. The IC9700, the IC7610, and the IC7300 SDR transceivers are top of the line and are the first choice for contesters and DXers across the globe. Create your own band opening with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy: faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. It has a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, dual digicell. Both the ICOM IC9700 and the IC7610 have Ethernet connections on their back panels to allow direct connection to your router without a server PC for remote control using the RSBA1 software. The ICOM IC7300 changed the way that entry-level HF is designed. This high-performance innovative HF transceiver with its compact design will far exceed your expectations. RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, SD memory card slot. Remote control can be made using a small computer or Raspberry Pi using the RSBA1 remote control software. This is amazing. So even if you live in an HOA or in the center of the city, where ham radio operation may not be ideal, ICOM has a remote base station solution with just the right rig to fit your requirements and budget. Please, when you visit your favorite dealer to purchase your ICOM rig, be sure to tell that dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now, back to our QSO. And we were talking a little bit before the show that you kind of moved to Denver and joined a line of business that wasn't long-lasting.
That's true. Yeah, well, you've had the experience.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, you've had the experience. You know about the oil shale business and how it was really strong for a long time. That's what brought me out to Denver, me and my girlfriend at the time, and a couple of other friends of mine from the Raytheon company. We were working back in Waltham, Massachusetts, and they needed somebody to come out here and run the office. And so we did. I was set up as the manager here, and Doris, now my wife, and a couple of other folks ended up running projects for me all over the U.S. We did work for nuclear power plants, oil shale business, a number of other things where they needed environmental studies before they could build facilities or do certain kinds of work or lay in power lines or whatever. It was a fascinating time to be here. I ran a group of what we call bugs and bunnies people, the environmentalists who would go out and do surveys, what they called environmental impact statements. And that kept us busy for a good long time until oil shale went bust.
I was in Denver at the time, and the city changed overnight, or the Front Range changed overnight, from very active to ghost town.
Yeah, it did indeed. It changed in a dramatic way, and that's when I had that time off to do my studying and get the ham license.
So you get the first ham license. You're age 34. You have an advanced class license. What was next for you? What was it that attracted you to ham radio, and where did you go in the hobby?
I was attracted to ham radio from the time I was a little kid, but it was as a listener only at the time, because I was really into the broadcast business, and we'd have to get in the time machine and go back to 1962 when I started working at the University of Rhode Island as a student, but also as the engineer at WRIU, and we put on an FM station. We had a license in process, but it hadn't been finished. And we finally got it put through, and so I'm the engineer of record at WRIU FM, which at that time was just a 10-watt station serving the campus in Kingston, Rhode Island. Later on, they've advanced that. They've gone up to much higher power now, and they're heard all over Rhode Island and into Connecticut and Massachusetts. But back then, it was just a little 10-watt station.
So now you have a ham license. You're in Denver, Colorado, or you're on the Front Range. What did you do first? What was the first rig?
First rig was a little HW8. In fact, after I passed the tests, I ordered the HW8. And I don't know if you recall, Eric, but there was a Heathkit store in Denver up on the north side of town, up near, well, actually probably in Lakewood.
I think it may have been gone by the time I got to Denver in 84.
No, that's probably true, because this was 82. I bought the rig in, 78. I bought the rig in 77 after I passed the test, but before I got the license. And so I had a little time to work on the rig and figure out how to work it, how to get it to tune up properly and so on. It was a little direct conversion type thing. It had a little bit of getting used to there. There was no selective sideband or anything. It was CW only, and it was not what they call single signal. I'm not talking about single sidebands. Single signal means you only pick up a signal on one side of the carrier or the other, but not both. Unfortunately, with a direct conversion to audio, effectively, you're picking up a signal on either side of the carrier. And if somebody comes on a kilohertz down from the carrier and you work them, and somebody later on comes on a kilowatt above the carrier, you're going to hear both of them as if they're both in the same place. And so I added RIT to a receiver incremental tuning so that I could move my frequency around a little bit, at least in terms of what I was receiving, and be able to tune out the bad guy that came in and started copying the other side. And so the HW8 served me well for a while until I later on purchased a Ten-Tech. I bought a Model 544, which was called Triton 4 at the time, but they got sued. Ten-Tech got sued by Motorola over the use of that name, so they just called it Model 544 when I bought mine.
Well, it seems to me that the HW8 would have been quite a challenge for a new ham, because I believe it was a CW QRP rig, right?
That's correct, yeah. Rip-roaring 2 watts of CW and a direct conversion receiver, as I described. Not the best thing for a novice, if you will, or a beginner, but it was fun. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot from using it, and then when I got the Ten-Tech, I was happy as a pig, and you know what?
And so what did you do with the Ten-Tech rig then? Were you operating on CW, or did you end up going to sideband?
Oh, I did both. I spent a lot of time on CW. I did worked all states on CW first, and then I did worked all states again on sideband as a way of forcing myself to stick with the CW for a while. However, I'm an audio guy. I played in a rock and roll band in college, a bass player, guitar player, a little bit of banjo, And so I played in a folk music group for a while, too. And I did a lot of recording in the radio business. I was involved with several major radio stations in the Providence market and down in Westerly, Rhode Island. And so I did a lot of recording. And so I'm an audio guy, and I tend to prefer phone over CW. But I don't have an aversion to CW. I just prefer phone voice because that's the kind of thing that I grew up doing.
You've made presentations in the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, mostly antenna projects. So it seems to me that you have an attraction towards building and experimenting with antennas. How did that begin?
Yeah, that began when I got my license. I made a commitment to myself that for the most part, if possible, I was going to build all my own antennas. And I did for quite a while, and I still do. I've bought over the 40-some years now, 43 years that I've been a ham. I've built many, many antennas. I think I've had 3 commercial antennas in that time. One Yagi, a multiband Yagi, an ATB-34, Cushcraft, I guess it was. And I have an R5 vertical still here. I don't use it anymore, but I have it. And I bought one other antenna. What the heck was that? I forget. Anyway, those are the only antennas that I bought a D3W. When the WARC bands came on, I got the D3W from Cushcraft, which put me on, the 17 and 12 meter bands in addition to 30 meters. And I've still got that here somewhere on the fence. I have some hooks on the fence that I store these things on and occasionally break them out. But everything else I've done here has been homebrew, starting with rotatable dipoles, going to 2 and 3 element Yagis, quad antennas of various kinds, and then log periodics. My favorite antenna still is a log periodic that covers 10 through 20 meters. I have it up at about 60 feet high. And I've had that up there for 25 years now, and it's still going well. And the only problem I'm having with it at the moment is a tree is starting to snag it when I turn in certain directions, and now the rotator's broken. So the antenna still works fine, but everything else has failed, so I've got to get that fixed.
And why do you like log periodics? Are they more broadband?
Yeah, one feed line, no switches required to say I'm on this band or that band. They give reasonable performance for size. My LPDA that I'm using now, I've built about a dozen of them over the years, but the one I'm using now is 9 elements on 20 feet of boom. I have it up a little above 60 feet high, the 58 feet to the top of the tower, and then it's probably about 4 feet above that on the mast. And I like it because one feed line serves a good wide frequency swath there, 5 bands. I don't have to worry about switching. I get reasonable front to back on the order of 18 to 20 dB. And on the front, the forward gain, probably on the order of 5 or 6 dB. And that actually compares pretty well to a tri-band Yagi. They advertise a lot of Yagis having more gain than they really do. If you look at what they really are getting, it's probably on the order of 5 to 7 dB at best for the typical 3-element Yagi.
Well, with an antenna system like that, are you a DXer or contester?
I do a little bit of both. I'm not an aggressive DXer or contester. I'm probably up at around 265 countries, something like that now. On LOTW, I restarted. I have a bunch more from QSL cards that I got way back in the early days, but I restarted when when I finally got involved with it, and I'm up for around 260 some countries now, and I pursue it haphazardly, shall we say. Most of my time on the air is talking with friends, roundtable discussions, getting on 17 meters and meeting people and having conversations about things, not chasing the DX, but a lot of times I'll finish a conversation and someone will call me from a foreign country and add that to my list. So I work it that way. And then I get in some contests just to see what I can do and improve the performance of the antennas that I'm testing at the time.
What is the Over the Hill Bunch?
It's a group of people that get together on 38, 68, 75-meter group. We get together in the morning, and the name is one that I'm not too fond of, but when I joined, I didn't consider myself over the hill. Now I'm not so sure. I'm 77 years old, and I probably fit that category very nicely. But it's a great group of guys. There are about 200 names on a list that I put together of people who check in from time to time, and I'd say of those, probably about 10%, 20 of them are what I'd consider regulars. You can pretty much count on them being there every day. And I've also gotten involved in another group a little further down in the the extra portion of 75, well, actually on 80 meters, down in the 3600 range by 8 o'clock in the morning, get together for an hour with some folks. And they're all techies. So that's a different group. They're all scientists, engineers, long-term hams who have done a lot of spade work in the business, including people who ran companies like Tentec and Alpha and a number of folks who are college professors at CU. So I've got this heavy-duty intellectual techie crowd early in the day, and then a little later I talk with these other folks who are much more generalized. Some really sharp guys in there too, but others who are relatively new to the hobby and just want to talk to people. And it's a nice group of folks.
Well, I always think of 80 meters as being kind of a late-night, overnight band. How does it perform in the morning for you? Is it mostly ground wave, or do you actually still have a little bit of skip?
Depends on the time of year. We get on there in the morning around 9 o'clock, or it used to be an 8:30 start time, but now it's more, I think, more on the order of 9 o'clock in the morning. And then some of the guys are on there for 2 or 3 hours. I get in for a half an hour, and that's enough for me. I listen a lot of times while I'm reading email or doing programming, and if a topic comes up that I'm interested in, I'll join in. Otherwise, I just sit on the sidelines. But it's a really good group. The propagation changes depending on the time of year. And at one time we were competing. We had an afternoon session sometimes too. I don't get involved in that one. But in the morning, the propagation changes consistently throughout the time that we're on. And early on, it's essentially space wave direct, short stuff, and then skip is kind of hovering over our heads. And then as the morning wears on, the skip goes away and the local communication becomes good. And then as the absorption builds up a little bit higher, the signals start getting absorbed. And we're dealing with NVIS signals for the most part. And the guys who are running loops, or as I do, a magnetic loop or a low wire, do a little bit better than those who have verticals, because the verticals, the signals just get absorbed and don't come back down to any of us here. And so I have a better time talking to guys who have low horizontal loops or magnetic loops like I have here.
And now, are you on a city lot, or are you kind of out in the country where you've got some room for antennas?
I'd like to be out in the country. I've got a lot of aluminum here that I bought or traded for or earned by doing tower work, and it sits. I have it on hooks on the fence that surrounds my property. I'm on a 1/5 of an acre city lot here in the middle of a very noisy area. High tension power lines, the micro center store with all kinds of TVs and computers running all the time, and just a packed neighborhood with lots of noise sources. So I'm in the worst possible place to do DXing on 160. Let's put it that way.
Right, but yet you are a top band operator.
I am. Yeah, I shunt feed the tower. I have a 58-foot tower with about 15 feet of mast sticking over the top. And the LPDA, the way I've designed it, works as a pretty good top load. So I'm able to use that anywhere on the 160-meter band. I have a vacuum variable tuning that. The inductance, the inductive reactance, rather, is tuned out by a vacuum variable. And I don't have that remote controlled right now, but I've set it to a sweet spot where I can use the tuner in my radio to cover the entire 160-meter band. And I try to get into things like the Stu Perry contest. I like that one because it's fair to everybody. I've worked QRP on 160 meters because the guys who are really good contesters have really good ears, and they can hear me even at 5 watts out. And I've worked all states except 3, I think, now on QRP on 160 using that tower fed with 5 watts.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. What's the current rig?
Current rig is a K3S. I had a K3 shortly after they came on the market. I sold that to a friend of mine out in Kansas and upgraded to the K3S. And I'm delighted with it. It's a wonderful radio. I had the P3 to go with it, and more recently I've purchased the 1500, the KPA 1500 amplifier. So I've drunk the Elecraft Kool-Aid, if you will. I've also got the KX3 and the KX2, and an original K2 is what got me started with them back in the year 2000. I bought one, didn't build it for a couple of years because I was too damn busy working, but now I've got a pretty full set of Elecraft gear here.
Now, with the KX2 and KX3, do you take that out into the field?
I do. Occasionally go to a park bench. I live near a park down here, and I've done that on occasion. And a few times I've gone on trips where I've taken it with me and used it portable. And the KX3, I've actually been using that more for direction finding and noise location for friends of mine than I have for operating anything. The KX2, I've used that for DXing 5-watt level QRP. I don't do SOTA or any of that kind of stuff, but parks on the air, I can contribute to that a little bit. And so that's I'm going to be doing more of that here, I think, as time goes on.
Has the COVID pandemic changed the way that you operate or the kind of ham radio operating opportunities that you do now?
Yeah, I used to do field day out in the woods with folks, but when I was at Bell Labs, we did a lot of field days outside the campus up in North Glen, Colorado. Later on, I got involved with other field day groups or just did field day myself, going out to a park or someplace in the woods here. But yes, COVID changed things in one dramatic way. One of the things I participated in was the 100-year celebration for WWV. And what happened there, the Northern Colorado Radio Club put together a field outside, an area outside with campers and various other things, and we operated for a number of days outside the facility at WWV up in Fort Collins. And there, that was an in-person event before COVID struck, and had a wonderful time there. That was a great thing. I ran sideband for a while on a flex radio, which I had never used in my life before, but I found that to be a good experience. And a friend of mine, Ed Dower, KN1CBR, ran CW. But then they did a celebration a year later during the COVID period in 2020, and they did a 101-year celebration. But what we did there, instead of going to the site, we all operated from our home stations using the call WW0 WWV. And I don't know how many of us were involved in that, but I put in a lot of hours on that one and operated from my home station here.
You said that you had a story about Wayne Green. Wayne Green was the publisher of 73 Magazine, a very popular magazine, I think, from the mid-'60s until probably through the 80s, would you say?
Yeah, even before that, Wayne was an instigator for Byte Magazine. He also was a proponent of repeaters for ham radio. He was involved in that stuff early on, and although he was kind of a crusty customer, he was a fun guy, and I met him several times at Comdex. When I was writing for PC Tech Journal, I write under the name Augie Hansen for my books and for my articles and magazines, and did a lot of that during the 80s and 90s. And anyway, that's where I met Green. Wayne Green was at Comdex. We'd sit around and have lunch breaks in the room for journalists. As a journalist, writing for magazines, I had a press pass, and so I had access to that room. And Wayne and I had some really interesting conversations over our lunch breaks there.
I remember 73 Magazine as a kid. I was really into repeaters and stuff, still am. And that was a great magazine for kind of pushing the envelope there. That's also very interesting. Let's go back to magnetic loop antennas. You did a presentation at the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. And what I think is interesting about your magnetic loop antennas is you like big loops, almost like double loops for the lower bands like 80 and 160. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into loops and how they've evolved for you?
Yeah, one of the first ones that I built was a little octagon made out of copper pipe, about 3 feet in diameter. Well, a little less than that, actually. And I use that on 10, 15, 20 meters, 17 meters, a little bit on 12, although I couldn't find much activity when I was doing that. And that was tuned with a trombone-style capacitor, a homebrew type thing, where you have a sliding component inside of other tubing. And that's actually a split stator capacitor, as I noted in my talk. It's not called that. It's called a trombone. And another split stator capacitor that's not called by that name is the butterfly. I didn't use a butterfly. The sliding trombone, the problem with it is as you move the slide in and out, you're changing the length of the loop. What people don't seem to realize, or at least it doesn't occur to them right away, is the length of the loop includes the capacitor and any jumper wires that are necessary to get from the capacitor to the loop itself, if you happen to use it that way. And so anyway, I started out with that, and then over time I built the bigger loop, so about 5 feet in diameter, that covered 17 through 20 meters, actually 30 meters. And then I built some even bigger ones, and I said, well, what happens when I go to a loop that's 10 feet in diameter? And I put that on 3868, where I met the guys in the Over the Hill group, or the Over the Hill bunch, rather. And it worked well. I set that up. I put a vacuum variable on it, and I hung that from a tree branch in the backyard. And the capacitor was sitting out in the open, in the sun and in the cold and the snow and the rain. I set it to the frequency 3868, and I had it like that for 6 months through a whole winter season, and it never budged. I was really impressed that it stayed right on frequency. I tuned it to the middle of the audio passband that was required, and I used that thing for 6 months that way. However, that's a big antenna, and I said, what happens if I shrink that down by making it into 2 turns, but a smaller diameter? And then I went to 3 turns, and I used one there. The 2-turn loop that is on my QRZ page, by the way, is a 40 through 80 meter. I've used it on 60 meters as well. And that's 2 turns. I don't call it a double loop, by the way, Eric, because that implies something else. Some people make a double loop, but what they're talking about is paralleling 2 loops of a given size to make it look like a fatter conductor. In my case, it's a single conductor, but turned in such a way that it's a 2-turn coil, if you will, but widely separated turns, because if you have them too close together, it doesn't radiate. It becomes a solenoid that doesn't radiate much, or it just has a lot of energy in the near field, in the reactive field it's called, but it doesn't radiate well. You have to separate those turns a bit by about 4 diameters, or maybe a little bit more if you can do it, in order to get proper radiation from that kind of an antenna. But the 6-foot one is the one that I use on 80 and 160. In fact, I can tune that down into the broadcast band, but I don't use it there, obviously. I can go down to about 1,400 kilohertz with that. But that's 3 turns, 6 feet in diameter, about a 68-foot piece of hard line, 7/8-inch hard line. Very heavy, unfortunately, so it's a kind of a monster to move around. But I can rotate it and aim it in certain directions to avoid noise by putting them in the null, or in other circumstances, aiming to increase the signal strength from a particular area. And I've had really good success with those multi-turn loops. Now, the problem is the program I have only does single-turn loops right now, the one I'm working on. But I'm in the process of adding multi-turns to that. A lot of people have requested that capability, and I want that. And so I'm working right now to validate formulas that I've found, or that I'm creating in a couple of cases, to properly calculate these loops, figure out what the inductance is, what the tuning range is going to be, what the Q is going to be, that sort of thing. So that's my next step in the process of developing the STL Calc program that I was talking about.
Right. So just to be clear, that STL Calc program is what you presented at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in August, and that allows one to put in the dimensions or put in the frequency of the loop that they want to build, and it spits out the dimensions that you need to have. The amount of hard line, whether you're using 7/8 or half-inch or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, well, you have to put in all of those values. You have to specify the length, the diameter of the conductor. What I'm using is the hard line. I'm just using the shield part of it as a fat conductor, if you will. And then the tuning capacitor value is given to you as a result of that. You specify the frequency, and then what happens is you'll get back a set of values that tell you, in order to tune the frequency that you have specified, you need a capacitor value of X given this length of loop. But it's a planar loop. It's a single loop that's all in the single plane. And going to the multi-turn loop, you're going into the regime of a helix, where you have to do a totally different kind of calculation. Normally, a coil is much longer than it is in diameter. In the case of a magnetic loop or STL, I prefer small transmitting loop because it's more accurately described what we're working here. But in order to map those things, what you're working on is a very large diameter short coil. And the formulas for the long, thin coil don't work. You have to use a different set of formulas to do this job correctly.
Where do you find the vacuum variable capacitors? I mean, you don't see them in DigiKey or Mauser. Where do you find them?
Yeah, there are two sources. I use one stateside here. Alan Bond runs a company called Max Gain Systems out of Atlanta. And I go to his website. He has a way of getting these things out of surplus equipment. Military, medical equipment, various other things. They use vacuum variables in MRI machines, in a lot of transmitters for military use, various other things like that. And he gets the surplus equipment, pulls the vacuum variables out, and tests them to make sure that they meet the spec. Or if they don't, he'll tell you what the actual value is. And in many cases, they'll high pot test to a much higher value than is listed as their maximum, their peak voltage. And so I buy from him. He gets all these things. Most of them are surplus, but he does get some new. He sells the Jennings line, the Comet line. Another source of these these vacuum variables is Russian surplus stuff. And there are some sites on the web that you can go to get the Russian vacuum variables. A friend of mine got one that's a 500 picofarad, 15 kilovolts, and he built a 3-turn loop like the one I have. Although he painted it black, so it looks like the Darth Vader version. Mine has a white frame. His has the all black, and so it looks like Darth Vader to me anyway. But anyway, he's using a Russian vacuum variable on his, I believe, and people have good success with that as well.
And where do you find a length of hardline that meets the requirements for your loop antennas? Do you have a source?
Yeah, it pays to know people who work for wireless companies. I happen to have a friend who worked at AT&T Wireless, and now they have different names for these companies. But what happens is the wireless companies, every 10 years or so, they take out the old coax or hardline and put in new. And they'll end up taking the old stuff out and throwing it away. Well, why throw it away? It's good. I can use it for a big fat conductor. I don't care if it's crappy inside. All I care about is the copper is good for a fat conductor. And so I've gotten pieces up to 70 feet in length from that source. And if you approach a cell phone company or any company that uses a hardline like that, even TV stations or places like that, you can probably find this stuff for free. They'll be happy to have you take it away so they don't have to recycle it or keep it somewhere. And that's where I've gotten all of mine. I have 1/2-inch and 7/8-inch hardline that I use for that purpose.
Yeah, I'm looking out my window right now at a radio site where we have our 2-meter repeater. The water tower where our repeater's at has 10, 12, 20 of these 1.5-inch hard lines where they actually just cut it off at the top and they left it there. It goes down the side of the tower and then goes underground to a building where it's no longer being used. I've thought a few times about who do I talk to about just, going and pulling that stuff out, taking what we need for what we need and selling the copper. I'm surprised that people don't do that.
Yeah, it surprised me too. And I was fortunate enough that the fellow that I got it from is Eric. He used to work for AT&T Wireless, as I say, K0KE. A good ham, a really good DXer, and a good friend who was bequeathed upon me. I even got some from him that was 1 5/8-inch hardline, but that stuff was just too big and heavy. I couldn't use it.
You wouldn't recommend that. That's what I see on the side of this building here. I mean, it would take maybe a crane to lift it off.
Yeah, even short pieces of that. I made a loop about 2.5, 3 feet in diameter, I guess it was, and the thing weighed so much that it was hard to support. I gave up on that idea very quickly.
So 7/8 is a good size. Would you use 1/2-inch?
I've used a 1/2-inch in several loops. In fact, I have one right now that looks like the one that's pictured on QRZ.com under my call KB0YH. And but this one is instead of 4.5 feet in diameter and 7/8-inch hard line, it's 1/2-inch hard line and only 28 inches, so 2 feet 4 inches in diameter. But it's a 2-turn loop, and I can use that on 20 through 40 meters very successfully. In fact, I have it tuned on 40 right now, and I was using it over the past couple of days to make contacts, and it works beautifully, and only a little over 2 feet in diameter.
Now, if you compare these antennas to, I guess you can compare them to a vertical or you can compare them to the log periodic that you have, how do they perform? It doesn't seem intuitive that an antenna sitting, 6 feet off the ground doesn't have a lot of wire in the air should perform at all.
Yeah, the capture area, the antenna effect, if you will, is diminished when you go to smaller and smaller sizes, and you just have to accept that fact. What you have to do is a proper comparison. Don't compare the magnetic loop or the STL to a log periodic. The log's going to win every time, but compare it to no antenna at all. In that case, you've got infinite dB gain over what you have if you don't have an antenna. And these antennas, I design them and build them. I don't need them here. I really don't have a reason for using magnetic loops or small transmitting loops, but I do because I want to know how they work. I had two motivating factors. One is I wanted to learn something new, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. But I've also helped a number of people who couldn't get on the air otherwise unless they had the antenna hidden in the back of a closet or in the attic or in the back of a garage somewhere or hidden in the bushes behind the house because they're in restricted areas. And that's one of my primary motivations for doing this, entirely altruistic in that regard.
So it's an ideal antenna for an HOA.
It is indeed.
And will it operate in the horizontal plane?
It will, as long as you put it at dipole height. If you put it horizontally, you end up with a pure omnidirectional horizontally polarized antenna. But in order for it to work as well as a dipole or to work at all, it really needs to be at dipole height. I wouldn't go less than a quarter of a wavelength high, and I'd prefer to go a half wavelength high if you could to get the best performance out of it. But I've used that. I did that on a 20-meter roundtable. There was an ICOM group that I was part of for a while. And instead of using my log periodic antenna, which had gain toward the east or whichever way I was pointing it, but the guys off the backside didn't hear me all that well, I put up a 20-meter designed specifically for 20 meters, about 5.5 feet in diameter, maybe a little bit more than that. And I've tuned that on 20 meters, and I had it at about, I think I had it about 35, 40 feet high. And it worked really well, horizontally polarized, omnidirectional, and I was able to pick up signals from all directions without worrying about where I had the antenna pointed.
Now, you said earlier that you live in a neighborhood where you've got a consumer electronics store nearby that generates a lot of noise and high power lines that also generate a lot of noise. How does this antenna compare to the other antennas when it comes to electronic noise?
Yeah, the verticals pick up that noise worse than the log periodic, obviously. I can aim away from those noise sources with a directional antenna. The magnetic loop antennas or the small transmitting loop antennas, I can null out one of the major noise sources, and it turns out not to be the microcenter store so much as the power lines that run essentially along my eastern perimeter about a tenth of a mile away and then do a dogleg off to the southwest. And those things get outrageously noisy at times. And so if I put the null of the loop in that direction, that does help me hear some of the weaker signals. But I have a constant noise floor around here on the low bands, the low frequency bands, I should call them, 40 and 80 and 160. Constant noise floor there on the order of about S6 or so, maybe more. And at night on 160 it gets up around S9. The loop does give me a chance to cut that down a little bit. I also have some other receive antennas here, Eric. I have a wire that runs along my back fence about 6 feet off the ground and extends. A neighbor of mine was kind enough to let me extend it along his back fence. And so I've got about 150 feet of wire, and I feed that through a 9-to-1 transformer in here, and I use that as a receive antenna.
That's a beverage antenna then, something like that?
It would qualify as a beverage on 40 meters, but not on the other bands because it's too short. But it's a low receive wire, and it has that characteristic. It's not terribly directional because it's too short, but it does cut out a lot of the noise. It gets me down to about an S4, S5 noise floor at different times of the day, a little bit higher at night, but it's still an advantage. It gives me an advantage in terms of signal and noise ratio, which is really what I'm after.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
The noise that I'm mentioning is just growing year by year. I know Rob Sherwood, you did an interview with him, and in his talk, he described that as one of the major problems, and I happen to agree. I'm in a situation where that really affects me. He's got a nice antenna farm up there north in Alt, Colorado, so he's not affected by it except when he works in his Denver location. But here it's just getting outrageous. It's much worse than it was even 10 years ago, and not going to be getting any better, I'm sure. The other thing is bringing ham radio to the youngsters, getting them involved. I really, I've encouraged several people. I've got a neighbor who was against my having antennas early on, but as he grew older, he grew to appreciate what I was doing here, and now he's a licensed ham. He's up in, I think, in Washington State now. He got his college degree and is working in one of the engineering facilities associated with dams and locks up there, I believe. But anyway, I've encouraged other hams through friends of mine at the Boulder Amateur Radio Club, run a BARC Juniors group, and we've helped some of those kids get going, and a number of other neighbors that have shown an interest in ham radio. But we've got to bring in a lot more people than we have. We're losing people by the day and not bringing in replacements fast enough.
What would be your solution? Do you have one?
Yeah, it turns out a lot of the kids are really good with computers. And if you can get them interested in some of the digital modes, at least as a way of getting them started, you're not going to necessarily get them to bite on CW right away, but they don't really need to now with the licensing the way it is. But get them interested in some of the digital stuff. And once they get a radio hooked up and start communicating and doing DXing, they say, man, this is fun. And then they can move into sideband or CW. I know a lot of folks who came in, didn't have a CW test to pass, but now they're really good CW operators because they found it something they liked. They got on and started doing it, and man, this is cool, and then I can work DX and get through where I can't with the phone, and so they start using CW, and then they become really good operators. A couple of guys that have been on some of the field days that I've been to started out that way, and they're really just terrific operators now.
What's the opportunity, say in Denver or in the Front Range of Colorado, to create some kind of demonstration where you actually attract young people to see amateur radio? What are the opportunities for that?
That's a good question. And right now, with the schools being shut down the way they are, that's not a good opportunity. I was at one time trying to start a ham radio club at the school where my daughter went. I have a younger daughter who's now in her mid-30s, but she was in the IB program here, the International Baccalaureate at George Washington High School, and I wanted to get a radio club going there. But the administrative challenges are intense, unfortunately, getting the schools to allow people in, to have equipment purchases made, that sort of thing. Even donations to the school, they're a little reluctant to do that kind of thing. So I'm not really sure what the alternative would be other than just personal contact with people and saying, hey, look, why don't you come down and listen? You might enjoy what you hear on the radio.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
The technology. I'm being an electrical engineer as I am. I'm really fascinated by the new technology, the direct synthesis kind of stuff, the digital processing, the kind of strides that are being made in these SDRs is phenomenal, and it's changing the way ham radio is being done in a way that I think is very favorable. When you look at companies like Elecraft and Flex and others that are making headway here and being copied very quickly by all the Japanese companies, we're getting some phenomenal equipment here that is becoming less expensive to make because of the technology and performs better than what we've had in the past. So I think we're on a good course here for long-term development of this kind of technology.
Gus, do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams?
Yeah, listen, because if you're away for a while and you don't know what's going on during that time, you were away for a long time, and I was out of the hobby for about 4 years, and even then, when I came back in, this was back in the late 90s, early 2000 time frame, I was working 90 hours a week and didn't have time for ham radio. All I had time for was airplane trips and teaching classes. But yeah, you have to listen to see what's going on, get familiar with the technology and the way it's being used now, especially if you're going to do any contesting or DXing. You really need to have a feel for the pace of things and where to tune to get your signal through. So listening first, and then and then bite the bullet and dig in and get it done, because if you don't get on and try, you're not going to succeed. So listen first and then try later.
Before we go, Gus, we remember this week the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11th, 2001, killing 2,726 people ages 3 to 85 years. I think that all of us remember where we were when we heard the news. You were at or close to ground zero on that day. Can you tell your story?
I used to teach classes in those buildings. I was the product that I was teaching. I did industrial training, not academic training, and I was teaching people how to use what's called a middleware. In this case, it was a translator. If you have computers on Wall Street handling things like trades, stocks, bonds, whatever, or doing any kind of financial trading, computers don't necessarily know each other's languages. They have different formats. They have different codes that they use, and they got to have some way to get messages in and out. And are you a Star Trek fan by any chance?
Of course.
All right. You know, the universal translator, you talk in English and it comes out in Vulcan, whatever. Although I never did understand why when the guy was talking in Vulcan, his lips were moving in English. But the translator had nothing to do with that. But the middleware that I was teaching was the stuff that allowed those computers to talk to each other. You take the message in, break it into all of its little pieces, reassemble it for the destination, and multiple destinations usually. And also, if necessary, you would enrich the message going out by adding information that's needed by the receiver that isn't available from the transmitter of the message. Anyway, I was teaching classes. I was in New York on the first day, the Monday. Things went normally. And then the second day, I guess it was a Tuesday, I was in an elevator on the way up, and the whole building shook. I was one building down from the New York Stock Exchange and not very far away from the Trade Center when that happened. And I got to the training room and looked out the window, and papers coming down, 8.5 by 11 sheets or business-size sheets coming down like big snowflakes. I wondered, what the hell is going on here? And then it wasn't long after that the second plane hit. So we had to send everybody away and say, look, find someplace safe to go, because this was not an accident. It was a purposeful event. And so I ended up in the debris field on the way back to where I was staying over on Rector Street, which is, are you familiar with New York at all?
I know the area you're talking.
Well, I was just a little bit north of Battery Park, it's called Battery Park City. And we had an apartment there that on the 28th floor. I got back in there. I looked out the window, and down comes the South Tower fell before the North Tower did. And it was just dust and dirt everywhere. I shut off the air conditioner. The power went off and took care of the rest of it for me anyway.
And you were a few blocks away?
Yeah, I was within the fall zone. If the tower had tipped over in my direction, it would have easily hit me, because it was 1,300 and some feet tall to the top of the tower. I lost two of my friends from work, the two ladies who set up my classrooms and arranged for me where to stay and all that kind of stuff. And I probably, from what the last count I got, was about a dozen of my former students had been caught in the North Tower. The North Tower was hit first, and then the South Tower was hit. But the South Tower was hit further down, and it fell first. And then the North Tower came down afterward. But anyway, long story short, I ended up getting put on a tugboat and sent over to New Jersey across the Hudson River, and then had to find my way around. Fortunately, I have relatives that live in New Jersey. My wife is from New Jersey originally. And they eventually, about 12 hours later, were able to get to me and bring me back to their place in Mountainside. But that was a tragic day for everybody. And I didn't want to get into that story because it's really long, but I thought you might be interested in knowing that had happened.
It's kind of like what my parents said in 1963, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It was like one of those moments, right? I remember exactly where I was when it happened. I remember exactly what my reaction was. Like, it was so unbelievable that something like that could happen.
You know what, Eric? I was in the studio for WRIU. We had the AM and FM stations. We were quiet at the time. It was not a time of day when we would normally be on the air. But the UPI machine, or I'm not sure which one. Yeah, we had AP, I guess it was. Anyway, 5 bells went off. That's an alarm. That's the highest level alert that you get through those services. And I was there, and I immediately put the stations on the air, and we did news for the rest of the day. and I was ripping and reading the whole time, along with a couple of friends of mine who came over and helped out.
On the day of the Kennedy assassination.
On the assassination of Kennedy, yeah. Another tragic day in my history.
I was not very old at that time, but I remember my parents' reactions. And maybe that was one of my first television memories, was his funeral in Washington. Thanks for sharing that story, Gus. Gus, I want to thank you so much for the contributions that you keep making to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, because they're great and they're available up on Expo website right now. At least the one for August are actually in the Expo that's running until September 13th. And then after that, they'll be on the Expo website. And I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. This has really been nice.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed it very much and look forward to more expos in the future. You're doing a great job with those.
Thank you. 73.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Gus. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KB0YH in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.